When do you ever get to have this much quiet around you, right? Everyone gets to take a nice breath. We okay to give it one more minute, Jill? Okay, we're gonna give folks one more minute and then we'll get going. I'll turn the meeting over to Mandy and Kathy and Jill tonight. Just watching for more folks to come in. Okay, I think more folks will continue to join. I will watch for them to come in, and I'm going to let Mandy go ahead and get us started. Thanks so much.
All right, so my name is Mandy Kent. I'm one of the network leaders for the Salt Lake Family to Family Network. The Family to Family Network is a statewide parent support network that's run by volunteers. It is designed to educate, strengthen, and support families of persons with disabilities, especially those who are on the waiting list to receive services from the Division of Services for People with Disabilities. Network leaders are parents of individuals with special needs, and we help link families to local resources and services and disability-friendly events. The Family to Family Network is a project of the Utah Parent Center. Some of the things that we do is provide support through local meetings, in person or online. All of the Salt Lake meetings are online right now. Information and referrals. It's families providing support to families. We also help with tips on how to advocate for your family member who has a disability and for your family. And then again, we support people who are on the waiting list to receive services through the Division of Services for People with Disabilities. So tonight, our presenter is Jill Sharp. Jill is a speech therapist who is currently working as a school-based speech therapist. And we are excited to have her talk to us tonight and teach us some things about speech services in the schools. So I will turn the time over to Jill.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I have done, like all of us, many Zoom meetings over the last year, but to be honest with you, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this particular Zoom meeting because I miss the experience of being able to share a space with parents as I talk with them about their children and their needs. So bear with me if I get a little bit discombobulated as I pull up different things to reference and answer questions, but I hope I can be helpful to you tonight, and that we can answer some basic questions and give some information. And then toward the end, if you have specific questions, I'm certainly open to answer what I can for those as well. So when Mandy invited me to speak tonight, it was kind of a wide open topic. And so I'm going to start with just kind of some basics and procedural things, and then some really basic information on language and speech development. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. Then again, as we reach the end, if you have other questions, that I don't cover during the presentation, I'd be happy to answer them. All right, thanks. Okay, so I am a speech language pathologist. I am certified by the American Speech Language and Hearing Association and licensed in the state of Utah to practice both in the schools and in clinical and medical settings. I have about 9 years of experience in the school setting. I've worked in traditional public schools, public charter schools, and private school. I've also worked in settings including outpatient pediatrics, outpatient adult care, inpatient rehabilitation, skilled nursing, acute care, long-term acute care, private practice. So I haven't done quite everything in the field, but I've done quite a bit of it. I enjoy being a clinical instructor and supervisor, and I most enjoy being a mentor to clinical fellows. And then I am an aunt, a daughter, and I'm a human to 2 sheepadoodles. So that's kind of my life in a nutshell. I don't have any financial disclosures. That's a thing in our world. We have to present that, and I'm not representing any past or present employer tonight. So to start out with, I thought we could talk a little bit about when do children receive speech therapy in the schools. And when we say speech therapy, just as a kind of a definition, that's anything that a speech language pathologist could do. So it is sort of a blanket term. And this is these are definitions taken from the August 2020 Utah State Board of Education Special Education Rules. Excuse me. These are really basic definitions. Special education law is complicated and complex, and I am experienced, but not an expert in that area. So generally speaking, most students who receive speech therapy in the school are going to be receiving therapy under the services of an IEP or individualized education program. This comes under IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and which guarantees our students FAPE, or free appropriate public educations. I'm sure many of you have heard all of those acronyms before, but I think it's always important to say what they mean. So when a student is receiving an IEP services and receives speech therapy, speech therapy can function as special education, which is specially designed instruction addressing core curriculum and making sure that the child has that FAPE for their core curriculum. We can also function as a related service, which basically in related services, we relate to the special education goals, or how the child benefits from their special education services. In order to qualify for an individualized education program or special education, a student's disability must adversely affect their educational performance. And I want to talk about that just a little bit more in terms of that's kind of a vague term. And it can be challenging for not only parents, but also for us as professionals to define education, how educational performance is affected. And I'll go into that a little bit more later on. Excuse me, I'm just going to work on my allergy voice. The other way that public school students receive speech therapy is under a 504 plan. That is the section of the Americans with Disabilities Act. These cases are fairly rare. Generally, it's based on a diagnosis that comes from somewhere outside of the school system, and the need for speech therapy needs limits the access and participation in the public setting. Generally speaking, if a student needs a 504, they have a disability that does not affect their educational performance. And the I think the primary reason why you'll find that this is so rare is because a lot of school districts and therapists don't quite know how to fit that into their program. And so there is also an issue of funding. Students who receive special education services receive funding through IDEA, and students who receive 504 services do not. So let's see. So I think one of the questions I get most often when people find out what I do is why their child doesn't qualify for speech therapy in the school. And again, that a child's disability must affect the student's educational performance in order to qualify. And oftentimes, if you have a child who has a mild to moderate speech sound delay or fluency disorder, that does not impact an education or their education. Furthermore, most LEAs or local education agencies, so school districts or charter schools, do have policies directing when a child can qualify for speech. Some examples are that on standardized testing, a student must fall 1.5 standard deviations below the mean on 3 tests, or 2 standard deviations below the mean on 2 tests, or 2.5 standard deviations below the mean on 1 test. In addition to standardized testing, one of the things that should be happening is in informal testing as well. And that's where a speech language pathologist has the latitude to qualify students who maybe don't fall into those testing ranges. However, it really can be difficult to demonstrate that educational need for a student who only has a speech sound delay or disorder. And you can ask for outside referral sources if your child does not qualify. And I would also encourage you, if you feel that your child should be receiving services and isn't, to go ahead through the process that's outlined in your parental rights and procedural safeguards, and access the Utah Parent Center to get some additional help with readdressing or appealing that decision with the district. All right, so let's talk about some milestones. And to be clear, speech milestones or speech development is a semester-long class in college, and language development takes about 3 semesters. So this is going to be very condensed. Excuse me. I elected not to start younger than 12 months with milestones because we are speaking about school age students. However, if you want to know more about those age ranges, there are a lot of resources available to help with that. So by 12 months, a child should be demonstrating variegated babbling. And what that means is putting together consonant vowel syllables in a string that's not repetitive. So they might say booga doo doo instead of just ba ba ba. Their utterance should sound more adult-like with intonation and prosody, or kind of stress patterns that mimic adult sounding sentences. And they should have approximately 12 consonants in their repertoire. So those consonants may vary a bit from child to child, and you won't hear them all the time, but that's what they should have. In the area of language, they should respond to their name consistently and to the word no. They generally should understand words like in and another and more. They can follow simple directions with a gestural cue. So that's when you give them a direction to put their toys in the bucket and point to the bucket, they can do that. They can usually express between 2 and 6 words beyond mama and dada. And they will talk and engage with listeners. And again, that's the sort of adult-like, not real speech. At 2 to 3 years old, by 2 years old, a child should have the consonants P, M, H, N, and W. 90% of children should have all of those consonants by then. They should be 50 to 75% intelligible. So you as a listener should be able to understand between half and 3/4 of what a 2 to 3-year-old says. The language at 2 years old, they should have between 200 and 300 vocabulary terms. So they've gone from 2 to 6 or around 10 if you include kind of the mama and dada, to 200 or 300. And then at age 3, they should have 1,000 vocabulary terms. They should understand the numbers 1 and 2 and the difference between something that's big and little. They can identify an item that doesn't belong in a group. They have an MLU, which stands for mean length of utterance, about the same as the age in years. What that means is they should be using sentences that are 2 to 3 words long, generally speaking. They engage in parallel play. So they don't really necessarily understand taking turns or sharing toys yet, but they'll sit down next to you and play the same thing with toys at the same time. They start asking more questions. They make conversational repairs. So if their listener does not understand what they mean, they'll try it in another way to get their message across. They're using pronouns like I, it, me, mine, and my and you. And they're using plural S and possessive S. Then by 4 to 5 years old, you should be understanding between 75% and 90% of what the child is saying. And in addition to the previous sounds, they should have BK, the G sound of G, D, F, and the Y that we spell with Y by 4 years old. Excuse me. And then for language at 4 years old, they have 1,600 vocabulary terms roughly. That increases by another nearly 1,000 by age 5. They're using past tense verbs. Their sentence length is getting longer to where it's averaging 4.5 morphemes or words and meanings per sentence or utterance. They can attend to a short story. They can follow simple commands, hearing them one time, and they can understand most of what's being said to them. So along the way, if you see deficits in these areas, or if your child ages past these areas and there are holes or gaps, that's the time to seek some additional services. And you can do that through the school system beginning at age 3. And then at 6 years old, 90% of children should have the T, R, L, and NG sound. By 7, they should have the SH, CH, J, voiceless TH, so that's. And then by 8, they should have S, Z, V, and the voiced TH, so th as in weather or brother or this. And then the last sound generally acquired by most children is the ZH sound. So that's kind of the pleasure, the zh sound in pleasure. And these are norms taken from Sander in 1972. And so then in the area of language, by age 6, they have ballooned up to 7,000 vocabulary words. And by the time they get to 12 years old, they should have 50,000 vocabulary terms. They can follow 3-step directions by around 6 or 7 years old. They can use sentences up to 9 words in length. However, most of us don't use 9-word sentences all the time, even as adults, only when they're called for. They might still be confused by complex sentences and instructions, but they're getting better at understanding those. Most of the language data was taken from a free resource called Communication Milestones by Lanza and Flahiv. You can find that online in PDF form. It has much more detail and has milestones in some other areas, including pragmatics or social skills, as well as feeding. So Okay, so I think this is a great time to take any questions on development, if any have come up. Okay.
So Jill, it looks like we're good for right now.
Okay.
I'm not seeing anything.
Thanks, Kathy.
I actually have a question. This is Julia. There's none in the chat, but can I ask a question?
Of course.
So the difference between speech, just to make sure that I'm understanding, and language is the speech is the specific sounds and the language is the actual full word.
Right.
So your specific sounds in the word. So
Right.
can you help to make sure that I'm
The speech,
understanding the thing?
yes, thank you, Julia. That's a great question. Speech refers to the sounds and the way that we form the words, and language refers to the meaning and the actual communication behind what we're saying. So speech, most of the time we're talking about just the way that our mouth forms the sounds or the way that our brain sends the sound to, or sends the signal to our mouth to make the sound. And then with language, we're talking about the actual words, the sentences, and the way that we then utilize those to communicate with each other.
Okay, because those two are different. And yet I think that's where I've been confused in the past, is how they're different and yet intertwined, etc. And then I do have one more question about, this is verbal expressive language, perhaps. Is that correct as well? Like this is coming from our voice, right? This is language coming from our.
So these milestones, some are receptive and some are expressive. So some are what we're hearing and understanding. Some are what we are expressing, and that might come from our voice, but it might also come through different modalities or forms of communication like sign language or assistive technology or augmentative communication. So language can come through whatever way we can get it out. And that's different for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. I appreciate it.
Okay. There are a lot of other areas in which school-based speech language pathologists can help. We can work on feeding. We can work on oral habilitation and rehabilitation. And so what that means is for somebody who perhaps was born with a hearing loss, as they are able to hear through hearing aids or a cochlear implant, we can work with helping them to process the sounds that they're hearing. Auditory processing disorder. Auditory processing disorder refers to there are, well, I'll just take a step back. There are a lot of steps or stops along the way from when sound enters our ears to when it means something inside of our brains. And auditory processing is kind of the road along which those signals take to get into our brain to mean what they need to mean. And so you can have an auditory processing disorder that's mostly based in hearing, or mostly based in your language or understanding of things, or a combination of both. Speech language pathologists do not diagnose that. That is something that's diagnosed by an audiologist. But once the diagnosis is made, we can help with, we can assist with some compensatory strategies and therapy ideas to help strengthen that process, and also help students be more successful in school. We can help provide services and accommodations for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. We can work on social skills. We like to call that pragmatics, which is the use of language. So we talk about form of language, which is the actual words, and then content, which is what it means. So that's usually what we talk about with vocabulary. And then the actual use of language, we call pragmatics, but we can call it social skills too. We can work with reading and writing. We can work with executive functioning, or kind of good academic skills for success, or planning your day out. And then we work with assistive technology as well. And that can be in the form of augmentative and alternative communication, or it can be in the form of things like text to speech or speech to text to help students with other needs. So we do a lot. I will say a lot of, even a lot of district supervisors and special education teachers are not always aware of everything that a speech pathologist can provide. And so sometimes we're doing teaching for our coworkers and our bosses on what we can do in addition to helping our families understand. The next section that I want to talk about is just the process of evaluation and IEP questions for speech therapy specifically. So the first step for an evaluation is a referral, and that can come from a parent. If you are going to make a request, I recommend that you make it in writing, and the school is required to respond to that. That is not only guaranteed, or that's not only your right through IDEA, but that's also codified in our Utah state laws for our academic access and accommodations. Referrals can also come from any member of a school team, from the classroom teacher to the principal to the speech pathologist herself, or anybody else. The next step is generally going to be some sort of screening or response to intervention. And every district and LEA does have their own policy and procedure for what's required on that step. And I can't speak to all the districts, but for the most part, the purpose of that is to show that that something less intensive than speech therapy won't resolve the problem. The next step is to get consent to evaluate signed by the parents or guardians. And then the school has 45 school days to complete that testing and determine eligibility. And so if you think about that, that's generally going to be around 9 weeks. And then after that eligibility meeting, the school has 30 days to complete an IEP if the student is found eligible. I think, speaking for myself and most other speech pathologists that I know, we usually try and do those meetings simultaneously, or, one, we do the eligibility and then immediately move into the IEP meeting, because we recognize that it's hard for parents to come to multiple meetings all the time. But if you, as a parent, don't want to do them immediately together, you don't have to. You can always request that be separate, just as long as you're willing to return for the IEP meeting within the 30 days. You are to be presented with your rights and procedural safeguards, and I, for a long time, have been a big fan of the Utah Parent Center. I think that that's a really wonderful resource for understanding your rights and safeguards. In addition to that, you should be able to ask questions of your speech pathologist, and if he or she doesn't know those answers, the district is responsible to help you get those answers as well. And then you can always reach out to the state board of or the state office of education as well, if you feel like you are having a hard time understanding. They do have an entire department dedicated to helping with questions and concerns. So then the IEP meeting, again, you should be presented with your procedural safeguards and rights. Please don't be afraid to ask questions if you have them in those meetings. The IEP is for writing proposed goals and proposed service minutes. I think another question that I get very frequently is why we choose the minutes that we choose. And I think the first thing that's really important to understand about that is it's not just up to the speech therapist or the school team to decide on those minutes. It's up to the entire IEP team. And that includes the parents and guardians. And it also includes the student if they're old enough to participate. I will tell you my thought process on determining the minutes that I will suggest. I try to look at what other services the student's receiving, and then the level of need they really have with their communication, and then try to balance that with how much time is reasonable for them to be out of their classroom or away from their other service providers. It is hard to find that perfect balance, and I don't know that I get it right all the time, but that's how I try to determine what I'm going to propose in a meeting, because it doesn't help a student with their educational goals or performance long term to be away from their class too much. The flip side of that is if they're not able to participate and progress in that class, then that's not serving them very well either. So that's where I come from. good questions to ask the therapist during this meeting is, one is, what can we do at home? And another is, how will this particular goal or this particular service help my child in school? And recognize that school is not just about grades and academics, but will it help them socially in school? Will it help them be able to communicate better with their peers? Will it help them be able to participate in more extracurriculars as they get older, or more, the words just left my mind. Anyway, the question is, how will this goal help my child in school now and in the future? And then another good question for the whole team to think about is, realistically, where do we see this student in 5 to 10 years? And are these goals and these services helping reach that point and reach that level of independence? There are questions that I get a lot that are really hard to answer, and I thought I would just share some of those with you. The first one is, how long will my child need therapy? There's really no way to answer that question. It's very dependent on many factors, including everything from school attendance to the severity of their disability to the support that they receive at home. Another question is, does my child need more therapy outside of school? The reason this is a hard question to answer is because we can get in a lot of trouble with our employers when we answer this question in the affirmative. So a different way to phrase that question that might be more beneficial to you and allow the therapist to answer a little bit more openly would be just asking for some referral sources for other outside therapy, or asking for areas that, or ask what areas might be impacted that the therapist doesn't work on at school or isn't able to work on at school. So basically ask what's going on that's not affecting educational performance that we might need to work on. And then the third question that I get frequently that's hard for me to answer is, what days and times will my child be seen? I'll just be really honest. Our schedules usually look really pretty on Monday morning, and by Friday afternoon, they're kind of a disaster. And so we can do our best and tell you what our plan is, but we can't always see the student on the same day and exact time. So just please keep in mind that we have things that come up like field trips and assemblies and fire drills that make it so we have to move kids around. And we'll always do what we can to keep it consistent, because we know routine's important for students, but a lot of times it's out of our control. So I do have some general principles for home practice. The first thing I want to talk about is frequency and duration. So doing a really long practice once a week or twice a week is less effective than doing 5 or 10 minutes a night. If you do 5 or 10 minutes 4 or 5 nights of the week, your child will make more progress based on research than if you do a whole hour once a week. Targets. So what should you work on if you're working on something at home? Well, that depends a lot on what your child's working on. If you are working with an AAC system, your target should be communication, and it should be working on the specific buttons and programming and sentence level or word level that your therapist or assistive tech team member has taught you to work on. If you're working on language like verb tenses or something like that, the best thing to do is model them and then work on a worksheet if you've requested one from your therapist. If you're working on sounds, sometimes if you're working on a speech sound that your child hasn't learned how to produce correctly yet, you can make it a little bit worse instead of making it a little bit better. So it's usually a good idea to check in with the therapist and see if they're ready to work on that or not. The most important time, or the most important thing that I like to tell parents is don't let your child's speech get in the way of communication. So don't practice when they're upset, or don't practice when they have something important to tell you. Let them communicate with you. You can practice later. Good ideas for everybody. Continue even with elementary age kids to say and sing nursery rhymes. That helps with not only with speech, but it helps with reading, and it helps with the decoding part of the reading, as well as the comprehension part of the reading. Extension and expansion. These are two types of language enhancement techniques you can use. And so if your child says something that sounds wrong, go ahead and you can just restate it in the correct way. So if your child said, "I runned outside at recess," you say, "Oh, I'm so glad you ran at recess today." And then that's expansion. And then extension would be that you then add additional information. So I ran at recess today. You would say, "Oh, I'm glad you ran at recess today. I like running too. You can run on a track. You can run on the sidewalk. You can run on the field," and talking about those things. Recasting is just part of that. It's just restating things in the way that sounds correct. I went ahead and put Sesame Street on here. I know it's hard to find. It's not on as frequently and commonly as it was when I think we were all growing up. And I'm not necessarily advocating that you stick your child in front of Sesame Street or any screen, but the skills that they taught for letters and sounds and reading, they're important. And if you can find those clips on YouTube, that will help. Read to your child and read with your child and listen to your child read. Those are all different things. So reading to a child helps them understand how books work and helps them understand the flow of sentences and paragraphs and passages. Reading with your child helps them understand and helps them become a stronger reader than just listening to your child read alone. But you need to do that too, because that allows them the practice of reading out loud to you. And then I just threw in the 60-60 decibel rule. One thing that is becoming a problem for speech pathologists and audiologists, we're seeing a lot more hearing loss at younger and younger ages. So the rule is if you or your child have headphones in or on, you should not exceed 60 decibels for more than 60 minutes. So it should protect your hearing if you'll follow that rule. And protecting hearing is an important part of communication. Okay, so I have some resources here. ASHA.org is the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, and their website is always changing. So if you want to find the public information, go ahead and put the backslash and the word public in there. Superduper.inc or superduperinc.com is a store, but these handouts are free. And then I've included the National Institutes of Health. So this is the National Institute for Deafness and Communication Disorders. That's their website. And then the CDC is at the bottom. And kidshealth.org just has some good general information. Okay, are there questions? Let's see. Julia, yeah, we can share the PowerPoint. It wasn't spell checked yet last night, so I wasn't ready to send it out, but I would be happy to.
That'd be great. Great information. Thank you.
I know that was fairly specified, but if there's anybody who has any specific questions specific to their situation, I'd be happy to answer them if I can. Okay.
Be a great chance to ask a question here. While they're thinking, we do have a quick poll. If people who are still here would mind answering this, I'm going to launch it while people are still asking or thinking about asking a question. This was great. I was going down the list of those milestones and all of those other things. I do have a question that came directly to me. Thank you for asking this question. It says, any particular speech therapy websites that you would suggest?
Sure. So that's a little bit dependent, I guess, on if you're looking for something local to you or just in general. There are some good kind of general therapy websites. One is called mommyspeechtherapy.com. Let me just make sure I'm saying that one correctly. And she puts up a lot of good information. And then there's one called Home Speech Home as well. And of course, both of these do have apps that they'll promote to you and things, but they do have some quality activities and word lists and really great resources too.
What were their names again? Mommy and
Speechtherapy.com.
Can you put those two in the chat as well?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Wonderful. Any other questions? I appreciate how you mentioned the Utah Parent Center. If there's questions about IEP specific questions, I had put that number in the chat. I'm going to put that in again. If you have questions, give the Utah Parent Center a call. There are district specific parent consultants and they'll connect you at this phone number. If you have questions about IEP or 504 specific things happening, thanks for mentioning that. Any other questions that people would like to ask? You're welcome to unmute and come. I know people love being off camera, but anything else people would like to know about? I do appreciate you taking just a moment and doing this poll. It helps us with our funding and lets them know that I was not out shopping. Although, you know, Amazon is my friend.
I have a question.
Thank you.
So I have my 5 years old. She had an IEP and a speech last school year, but this school year we decided to keep her at home because of COVID. But she's going to kindergarten next school year.
Okay.
My question is, because she missed this whole preschool year, what's gonna happen with her IEP? It's just gonna be transferred to school or what?
So are you in the same school district as you were before?
No, actually we moved. We're in a different district.
Okay. So what I would recommend is that you just take copies of it all in when you go to register her. And then what should happen is they'll give those to the speech pathologist and she will, she should contact you. You'll probably have to go through the evaluation process again, but that way they'll know about your daughter as soon as she gets there and then they can get started right away instead of waiting for the teacher to flag her or something. And they may be able to do an interim IEP depending on how long.
Oh, I think you froze there for just a second, Jill.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought you were frozen,
It
but I
may
guess.
have been both of us. Maybe
Okay.
everyone else heard that. I think we're okay then.
So I was just saying that you'll want to take the copy of the old IEP in right away when you register for kindergarten, so that, and then make sure that the speech therapist there, the speech pathologist, gets a copy of it too. And they might need to do a new evaluation depending on how long it's been expired. Or they may be able to do an interim and just use the previous evaluation data.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Okay. Mandy, do you want to ask any other questions or take care of anything else before we finish up tonight?
I'd like to thank Jill for taking the time to present to us tonight and giving us all of that information. That was great. I'd just like to say that we will be having another meeting next month about going over options for summer for our children. We do not have a date for that particular meeting yet, but we are working on that and we'll send out information. In June, we also are going to be having a meeting. Dr. Julia Conley, who is a psychologist, will be presenting to us. And she has some really great information to share. That will be on June 17th. And so we're looking forward to that as well. I'd like to thank everyone again for attending tonight and thank Jill for presenting for us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mandy.
Sorry, it's muted there. I'm in a noisy area, so trying to keep it muted.
No, you did great. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I thought so too. I learned a lot.
I did too. I had no idea that the numbers were that high on 2-year-olds.
Neither did I.
You know, I mean, I never had any neurotypical kids, so I have nothing to compare it to, but I had no idea.
Well, and I've been out of preschool for so long that I was like, man, I forgot all that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I want a copy of the PowerPoint just so I can have it in comparison when I'm working on AAC stuff. I'm like, okay, we got to bump up the volume. We got to get this, we got to get the mojo going on us, all this stuff over here. So that was, and Jill's like, Julia, you know this. And I'm like, I know, but these guys need to be reminded as well. The look she gave me was Julia. And I'm like, I know.
You know,
Uncle.
I know a couple of 2-year-olds though, and I don't think either of them have, and I don't think anything's wrong with them, but I don't think either of them have as many words as that. But how interesting. And I know everyone develops at their own rate, but
Yeah.
I had no idea. I mean, I don't think Matt ever had more than 200 words.
Dallin had about 500 to 600, but it was sign. That was sign. But with his communication, his AAC, all of his devices, he probably had 1,000.
That's good.
You know, if we put everything together, it was maybe 2,000.
That's
So-
really good. That's I can't remember what they told me in sign language, but it's a couple of hundred at that level you can communicate.
Oh yeah.
So
Oh yeah. So I loved it. I was like, oh, okay, we're gonna bump it up. So it was great. I'm glad she came on. It was a quiet group though. I was ready for a barrage of what about this and what about this? And
I thought there would be tons of questions, especially when, why does the speech therapist tell me this for the school? Like, because that seems to be the biggest issue with parent, like I'm sure you guys at the parent center, tons of phone calls. Well, they said this, why, but my child needs this.
yeah,
And that when I was working in the school as an OT, that was always, but my child has problems with their balance and coordination. Why aren't you working on that? The outside therapist says that they need this. Well, it doesn't affect their education.
right. Yeah, I was ready for much more to come in, but maybe they got what they needed. There were a couple professionals.
Yeah.
Those are the ones I was getting information about or in direct messages for. So I thought it was great. Thank you.
I thought so too. Thank you,
Yeah,
Miss,
I just
for
sent her a text and thanked her for presenting, and she's bummed that she didn't get any more questions from parents.
I was surprised because when my kids were young and we were doing all that, I would have ask 20 questions. I just am, long time out of that, but. And
Well,
we
there
did
actually
private
was,
speech therapy in addition to the school speech therapy for years. So we did both. And
Yeah.
we tried PECs too. I mean, our outside speech therapist focused completely on PECs and assistive technology. I mean, we didn't, she long since, but he had speech therapy through all his years of school.
We did PECs for like a minute, because he knew the communication. He knew what communication was, because he came from a different background, right? The illness, Dallin had the illness that changed his trajectory, and he never lost the desire for communication. It just got like blasted from the illness. And so PECs is to teach the value of communication, and he was like voracious. Dallin was a voracious communicator. He just needed 14 ways to get to it. So they wanted to do PECs, and I'm like, but he's to step 6. He doesn't need to sit down and start with here to here. I'm like, he knows why you communicate. He's already got it. We just need to give him this to this to this. So we did speech therapy until he was private, until he was like, I'm going to go do my life. I'm going to go over here.
That's what happened with Alexandra. I mean, we stopped when we moved out to Sandy. I stopped speech therapy with both of them privately and started and just did school. But right after that, she came to me and she said, I don't want to do it anymore. And she's old enough to make that decision. So, and, she needed it, but if she's not a willing participant, then it's silly. So I said, okay. And Matt, I don't know, take him going, him not going, it made so little difference because he didn't have any interest in what you thought. I mean, he had no interest in communications. He got his needs met. And it was amazing because if something happened and he needed something that required 5 words, he knew them. He just never used them because he wasn't interested in, outside of having his needs met. He wasn't interested in hardly any communications. But
it's
so PECs never worked either with him because you have to want to at some level.
Yeah. And how was it for you, Mandy? Do you guys do therapy?
We haven't done any outside speech therapy except for like social skills training, things like that. We did PECs for a little bit. My son was always tricky because he's very good at repeating movie lines or things like that at appropriate times because he's memorized all of that. It took us a long time to figure out that he didn't know what the majority of the words he uses mean or the majority of the words that we say. So now I'm constantly asking him, do you know what this word means? Do you know what I mean when I say this? Or it's gotten to where he'll tell me like the teacher said this, but I don't know what it means, but he won't ask the teacher. But I've gotten him to where he'll ask me.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that pragmatics of language is so important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it took forever before I realized he didn't know what things meant. And one day he said to me, why do you always get upset that we're going he very simply asked me, why are you always so mad when we're going to be late? You say we're going to be late. What does that mean? And I was like, you're like 9, almost 10, and you don't know what I mean when I say we're going to be late. And I was like, wow,